All right, so as Julie mentioned, I'm going to share with you some tools that you can use to identify weeds. And I'm going to be a little bit redundant just briefly. As Julie pointed out, there are really important reasons to know why, of why we want to have identifiable plants. There are a variety of reasons that you might want to know what your plant is. This can include anything that has to do with whether you want it on your property or not. That could relate to if it's palatable to any animals that you have grazing or if it's edible for human consumption. This can include if it's a native species, if you want to support native pollinators. This can also include if it's a toxic plant or invasive, anything that relates to your goals for what the land should look like. Knowing what plants you have will really help you get there. The next step of that also is once you know what it is, as Julie pointed out, then you know how to manage it. So the first step, of course, is knowing what it is. So I'm going to start diving into 3 different plant apps that have had a lot of use recently. The 2 on the left here, iNaturalist and PlantNet, are based on global communities who can help to kind of crowdsource the information to identify a plant for you. PlantSnap on the right side is actually based on computer algorithms that will compare a photo that you submit to an entire library of existing knowledge on certain plants, and it will come up with a few possibilities for what your plant could be. So for a little more detail, as I mentioned, iNaturalist relies on a global community of knowledge. It includes folks who might have extensive plant identification experience, botanists, hobbyists, farmers, gardeners, you name it, there's probably somebody there who knows what plant you have. The benefit of this is that it's really global. So if you have something that might be new to your area, there's still a good chance somebody else will know what it is. The downside is that it can take a few days or even weeks to get that person to find your plant and to tell you what it is. They do have web-based versions of this as well as apps for smartphones. Now next is PlantNet, which is very similar to iNaturalist. It also uses that global community of knowledge. And I should mention all 3 of these have free versions of their apps, so you don't have to pay anything to get engaged. One really neat thing about PlantNet is that they also are using the data that it creates to help improve automated plant ID. And that automated plant ID is what PlantSnap uses. PlantNet, like iNaturalist, also has a web-based option as well as smartphone apps. Now, PlantSnap is really smartphone-based. It works on both Apple and Android phones. I will say this one works best on flowers. So if you have something with a showy flower, a wildflower, or a weed, that will probably work really well with PlantSnap. It's less good at identifying plants based on their leaves. And so if you have something like a grass or a wildflower that doesn't have any flowers yet, PlantSnap might not give you very good results. And as I mentioned, this PlantNet helping to improve automated ID means that there are other apps in development. And so there's definitely a chance that there will be something that comes around that's even better. So we wanted to share some tips on how to get a good photo to use with these apps, because whether it's a person or a computer looking at your photo, it really helps to have certain characteristics of the photo that you submit. Things to focus on is try to have a solid colored background or something that contrasts really well with the plant you're trying to identify. Also, try to keep your hands out of photos. This is less of an issue when you're doing the community apps like iNaturalist and PlantNet, because a person is going to be able to tell that you have a hand in the photo. But PlantSnap or something using a computer algorithm might see your hand as part of the flower. And so just try to avoid having your hand in there. Do try to have close-up photos. The more detail that you can include, the easier it will be to identify what your plant is. On the same line, try to use something that will keep your photo well focused. So that could be an autofocus or a manual focus. Now, in general, try to get photos with flowers or fruit, and this applies both to grasses and broadleaf plants. But if there are no flowers or are no fruits that you can really discern, try to get a photo of a stem that includes leaves so that you're not just focusing on a single leaf. And that brings me to the things to try to avoid. A single leaf is not usually enough information to distinguish between similar species. And so you definitely want to try to get more than just a single leaf in your photo. On the same note, don't try to submit a photo of a landscape. There won't be enough detail for either a person or a computer to figure out what plant you're even looking at necessarily. Similarly, try not to submit any blurry photos. As I mentioned, the more detail that's visible, the better it will be identifiable. And try to avoid zooming in with your camera Although that might feel like you're getting closer, it actually does reduce the image quality and can make those tiny details harder to tell. I have a note at the bottom of this slide that points out that seedlings are really tough. And my best advice on those is try to just wait a couple days or a week to let that plant grow a bit larger so that it has more defining features. So I wanted to share some photos that I've taken, and we can talk about what's good and bad about them. On this photo here of a native species called crinkled onion, I will pride myself on that it is a focused photo. The flower is well detailed. It's also the center. The bad side of this is that the background is kind of hard to tell different from the foreground. So if I submitted this to Plant Snap, it might not be able to tell the flower in the middle versus the flowers in the background. And maybe the most obvious issue is that my hand is in this. And so Plant Snap might think my hand is the flower and not the flower. Now, this other photo is of prickly sow thistle, which is an invasive species, and it has different goods and bads. One thing that's good is I don't have my hand in this photo, but the downside is that the flower portion of the plant is blurry, and the leafy portion, which is the main focus, blends in very much with the background. It's almost the same color. It would be very hard, even for a person, to tell what's the specific plant and leaf shape that we're looking at. Okay. So from apps, I want to switch over to websites because we don't always have a smartphone with us. Some folks don't like using smartphones and all, and that is completely fine. We do have some really great websites that are constantly available. I'm going to focus on two primary websites from the University of California. The first one is the Weed Research and Information Center. It has a ton of different resources that I have linked here, and we will share these slides with you all later. I do want to highlight it has information for homeowners, it has information focusing on different landscape types, and it has an interactive weed ID tool, which I'll go through in a moment. The other really great website we have is the Integrated Pest Management website, which includes a massive list of common weeds, including images of them and details for how to identify them. And the IPM site also connects to multiple different county-based links that might have more relevant information depending on where you are in California. I do want to highlight these two websites focus explicitly on weedy species. And so if you are trying to identify a plant and it's not showing up, it's possible that the plant you have is not considered a weed by other entities. And you might want to just contact a person, contact your cooperative extension advisor, or find a local gardening group or other group that might help. Now, there are also, as I briefly mentioned, web access to the three apps that I shared. So there's a lot of online resources. And I'm sure there are even more that I haven't included today. So let's try using this Weed ID tool. Because my internet's not great, I'm going to just show what the process looks like in these slides. So here I have a photo of a plant that has a small yellow flower, very small little leaves. The photo is on a nice background that contrasts well with the plant, and there's no hands in this photo. So I'm fairly confident that if I submitted this to Plant Snap, it would be able to tell what the plant is. And if I submitted this to iNaturalist or PlantNet, the community would be able to help me identify what this plant is. So I know this slide is very busy, and just bear with me. You don't need to look at the right side at all right now. This is using the Weed ID tool through the Weed Research and Information Center. You'll select a weed type, which would be a broadleaf, a grass, or a woody plant, and then you'll get this large form that's on the right side of your screen right now. Each of these sections tends to have a little question mark icon. So if you're not sure how to answer the question, click on that and it will show examples of the different options that you could submit. When you're less sure about an answer, just don't answer it. You'll get more responses to your inquiry if you have less information in your form. It will get more specific if you include more criteria. So with this plant, you can see that I looked at, it was from an urban area in this case up here. It had a prostrate growth form, so flat to the ground. Now I populated this also with a life cycle because I happen to know this plant is an annual, but you don't need to do that one, it's not necessary. And so here's the general categories. Where was the weed found? There are 3 different areas, and then you just describe the system that you found it. Next, as I mentioned, I tend to focus on the growth form, so whether it grows upright or it's sprawling on the ground. Does it have any tendrils, which would make it look like a vine? And then does it have milky sap? And on this plant, I didn't break off a leaf or snap the stem, so I can't answer that, so I left it blank. The next category is leaf characteristics, which has multiple different things you can answer. how the leaves are arranged on the stem, whether they're a simple leaf, like one single large leaf, or a compound leaf, which is what we have in this photo here. There are also notes about hairiness on the leaves, spines, prickles, and the veins on the leaves. Next is the stem characteristics. So is it square or not? And that's a really useful characteristic for one particular family of plants. And then I also focus on, does it have spines or thorns? And lastly, you'll notice flower information is at the very end. So I really like this tool because if you don't have a plant that has a really obvious flower, you don't have to worry about it very much because that's a super small part of how to identify the plant. In this case, color is helpful and also the spines and thorns, but again, flowers kind of come at the end of this one. So based on what I submitted, I got only 2 possible matches, which is a really good response. If I had answered less, I could have gotten 10 to 20 different possible responses. I will say that this was the first one that came up, and if you recall, our photo doesn't look much like this plant. This plant doesn't seem to have those bright yellow flowers, and the leaf shape is very different. But this photo looks almost exactly like the plant that I had. And indeed, when I bring back our photo that we have, the plants look identical. And so this was a successful use of this weed identification tool to identify puncture vine or Tribulus terrestris. So with that, I do want to thank you, and I will turn over our time to any questions. Feel free, of course, to reach out to us. And as Julie mentioned, this is being recorded, so we'll be happy to send this out as soon as it's ready. So I will stop sharing.
From the app-based ones, is there one you find that tends to be a little bit more accurate when you're submitting them? One that's easier to help get the right weed?
That's a good question. I think I would rely most on iNaturalist. Partly, I believe it's been around the longest. Partly, I think it has the biggest community. And one benefit that I neglected to mention is that iNaturalist also allows you to submit images of animals like insects, reptiles, rodents, and birds. So if you have other questions about what's on your property, iNaturalist is kind of a one site fits all, has a great community for all sorts of things.
Which app do you recommend for identification of different grasses? That's a good question.
I think similarly, iNaturalist is probably your best bet because you will have access through the app to people who have extensive knowledge on all kinds of plants. I will also say, I think that sometimes photos of grasses can be really challenging, and sometimes that might be the case where you pick a sample, try to get the whole blade with leaves attached, with seeds attached, and bring it to somebody to help you identify. Grasses have really tiny details that can differentiate very different species, but from a distance, they can all look very similar. So unfortunately, I don't know of an app that would be a guarantee every time for grasses.
Yeah, definitely. That's one that, you know, there are some really common ones that we can help with, but then sometimes we really have to see the plant and look at some details to really know. So,
Rebecca, for the grasses, would you recommend one of the apps or going through the WeedRick ID, because you can use the cheat sheet to know what a ligule is, for example, to be able to see what your grass has?
That's a great point. You can definitely use the Weed Research and Information Center ID, like I showed very briefly with that puncture vine. That will help you figure out what parts to look at. But if it ends up being too much of a pain, like if the grass is a little too young to have those features obvious, then you can try to wait a little bit. And also, you know, phone a friend definitely helps to have somebody else get eyes on it, and they might already be familiar with the plant.